cobblestones of the Rue de Rivoli were still warm from the afternoon sun when the camera operator set down his wooden tripod for the last time that September evening in 1908. His name was almost certainly unknown even to the few people who watched him work. One of dozens of anonymous technicians employed by the Lumiere brothers' expanding network of cinematographers, dispatched across the continent with hand-cranked cameras, and a mandate so simple it bordered on the philosophical: record what you see. Not the extraordinary, not the staged, the ordinary, the unremarkable, the Tuesday afternoon. What those reels captured, and what remained buried in climate-controlled vaults, misidentified in archival catalogs, and largely unseen by modern eyes for over a century, is nothing less than the true face of a Europe that most people alive today have never encountered, not even in their imaginations. A Europe that existed in the precise, exquisite, irretrievable gap between the age of the horse and the age of the engine. A Europe that smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread simultaneously, where a duchess and a seamstress could stand on the same pavement and occupy entirely different dimensions of reality. The footage is imperfect. It shudders. It scratches. The frame rate makes the figures move with that peculiar nervous energy that modern viewers often mistake for anxiety, when in truth it is simply the mathematics of early celluloid. But look past the grain. Look past the mechanical jitter. What you see underneath is something that no historian's description, no oil painting, no photograph has ever quite managed to deliver. The continent in motion, alive, specific, irreducibly real. There is a sequence running approximately 47 seconds, filmed on a bridge in Vienna sometime during the winter of 1906. The Danube Canal moves beneath. A woman crosses from right to left, carrying what appears to be a basket covered with a pale cloth. Laundry, most likely, or perhaps provisions from a market stall. She does not look at the camera. Almost no one in the early Lumiere footage looks at the camera, and this is one of the details that makes it so devastating to watch. They have not yet learned to perform for the lens. They are simply existing, moving through their morning or their afternoon or their cold December commute, with the total unself-conscious authority of people who do not yet know they are being preserved. Behind her, a tram moves across the upper edge of the frame. One of Vienna's electric trams, introduced in 1897 as part of the city's extraordinary municipal modernization program. And the sound the tram would have made, had the camera been capable of recording it, would have been a high, singing whine from the overhead wire combined with the deep iron percussion of the wheels against the rail joints. Every 40 meters, a joint. Every 40 meters, that sound. The people of Vienna in 1906 no longer heard it consciously. It had become part of the sonic wallpaper of their city, as invisible to them as the smell of the river or the particular quality of winter light that falls at that latitude, pale and directional, casting long shadows even at noon. What the lost footage reveals, and this is the mystery that film archivists and historians have been quietly assembling for decades, piece by recovered piece, is that the Europe of 1895 to 1914 was a place of almost incomprehensible sensory intensity by the standards of its own inhabitants. The Industrial Revolution had not simply changed the economy. It had changed the human nervous system's daily experience in ways that contemporary writers struggled to articulate. Charles Dickens had attempted it. Émile Zola had attempted it. But prose, however brilliant, is still an abstraction. The camera was not. The camera recorded that in Paris, in the summer of 1900, the intersection of the Boulevard des Capucines and the Rue Scribe was crossed by no fewer than 7 distinct modes of transport within the space of a single 2-minute reel. Pedestrians on foot, horse-drawn omnibuses, private carriages, delivery carts loaded with barrels, a lone cyclist navigating between larger vehicles with the alert, improvisational skill of a matador, and one of the city's first automobiles, a de Dion Bouton, almost certainly, its driver perched high on the seat with the particular posture of someone who is operating a machine that has not yet determined whether it is trustworthy. The entire scene is negotiated without traffic signals, without lane markings, without any visible regulatory infrastructure whatsoever. And yet it works. It flows. It moves with the organic, self-organizing intelligence of a system held together entirely by eye contact and collective habit. This is one of the first things the footage dismantles. The myth of pre-modern chaos. We have inherited, through decades of popular history and period drama, a vision of the pre-war European city as a place of dirt and disorder, of disease and ignorance, barely held together against the pressures of modernity. The footage disagrees entirely. What it shows instead is a world of formidable implicit order, a social choreography so deeply internalized by its participants that it required no external enforcement. A baker in Bruges knew, without being told, precisely how to step around a delivery horse, precisely how much space to leave for the woman behind him with a perambulator, precisely when to accelerate, and when to pause in the narrow medieval street that had been channeling human traffic since the 15th century. The knowledge was bodily, encyclopedic, passed down through 10,000 mornings of the same route, the same hour, the same rhythms, and yet within that order, attention. This is the second thing the footage reveals, and it is darker, more complicated, and more important than the first. Because the Europe of 1900 was not one world in orderly motion, it was, in almost every city the cameras visited, two worlds occupying the same space, with maximum contact and minimum acknowledgement. Stand in front of the footage from the Marais district in Paris in 1903. Not the grand boulevards that Haussmann redesigned for the carriages of the bourgeoisie, but the cramped, medieval interior streets that his renovation had deliberately bypassed. And you are watching a world in which the average adult male lifespan was 51 years, in which tuberculosis killed 1 in every 5 people who contracted it, in which the 12-hour workday was considered a progressive reform. The women in these streets wore long, dark skirts that swept the cobblestones. The fabric was wool, almost certainly, heavy, dense, practical, extraordinarily difficult to clean. And the hemline served the precise function of erasing the lower half of the female body from public view while simultaneously accumulating, over the course of a single day's walking, an invisible freight of mud, horse manure, coal dust, and vegetable matter from the market gutters. Fashion historians have noted, with some understatement, that the physical experience of being a working-class woman in a European city in 1900 was one of almost constant, low-level sensory engagement with the texture of the urban surface. 3 kilometers away, in the apartments that lined the Avenue Foch, or the Ringstrasse, or the Unter den Linden, the women who never appeared in the Lumière footage were wearing something entirely different. The Belle Époque was not a metaphor. It was a material reality, stitched in silk and structured with whalebone, expressed in the extraordinary, biologically implausible silhouette of the S-curve corset that pushed the chest forward and the hips backward and required, in its most extreme iterations, a waist measurement of 19 inches. The women who wore these garments had been corseted since childhood. Their ribs had grown around the compression. Their bodies had adapted, over years of progressive tightening, to a shape that was entirely artificial, and yet, from the inside, entirely normal. What this meant physiologically is still debated, but what it meant culturally is not. It meant that the ruling class of Europe had literally restructured the human form in the service of an aesthetic ideal, and that the form which emerged was so thoroughly marked as elite that no amount of imitation in cheaper materials could quite replicate it, because the body itself told the story of who had worn the garment since they were 6 years old. The cameras rarely entered those apartments. They were machines of the public realm, deployed in streets and squares and railway stations and, occasionally, in the landscaped parks where both worlds briefly overlapped, separated by invisible but absolute codes of proximity and posture. But there is a reel, filmed in Brussels in 1905, that captures something extraordinary entirely by accident. A carriage draws up to the entrance of what appears to be a hotel or a private club. A woman descends, assisted by a footman. She is dressed in the full architecture of upper bourgeois formality. Trained skirt, fitted jacket, a hat the size of a small table, trimmed with what appears to be an entire bird. She crosses the pavement in approximately 4 seconds, and as she crosses, the crowd on the pavement, workers, clerks, delivery boys, a woman with a heavy bundle on her back, parts for her with a speed and fluidity that is almost hydraulic. Nobody is asked to move. Nobody looks at her directly. The parting simply happens, as if the social gradient between them is a physical force. She walks through a space that was not there a moment before, and will not be there a moment after. And then she is gone through the door, and the crowd closes behind her, and the pavement is as it was. This is what the lost footage carries that nothing else does. Not just the image of the city, but the image of the social physics that organized it, the invisible rules that structured every interaction, every glance, every step taken in the wrong direction or the right one. The footage is a record of a world that never explained itself because it never needed to. Everyone who lived in it already knew. And then the war came. The first one, in 1914, the one that was supposed to end in 6 months, and instead lasted 4 years and killed 17 million people, and shattered the social architecture of the continent so completely that the footage from before it began to look almost immediately afterward, not like a record of recent history, but like evidence of a vanished civilization. The men who appear in those reels, the workers and the clerks and the carriage drivers and the cyclists navigating the Boulevard des Capucines, would have been, in 1914, between 30 and 50 years old. The right age, the right geography. The mathematics are not comfortable. A significant portion of the faces in that footage did not survive the decade. This is the weight the archivists carry when they work with the reels. This is why the footage, when it was rediscovered, in a Lyons warehouse in 1980, in a Prague Film Institute in 1993, in a Brussels notary's storage room as recently as 2011, the canisters still sealed, the cellulose still coherent against all probability, was not merely a historical curiosity. It was a species of evidence for which we do not yet have quite the right vocabulary. Not nostalgia, precisely. Not grief, though grief is present. Something closer to the experience of finding a letter written by someone who had no idea they were about to die. The terrible particularity of a moment that was, to the person inside it, simply a Wednesday. The cobblestones of Vienna are still there. Some of them, in the oldest districts, are the same stones that appear in the footage. The tram lines were rebuilt after the war, dismantled again, rebuilt once more. The bridge in that 47-second sequence still crosses the canal. The city has layered itself, decade by decade, over the city that the camera recorded, the way a living reef grows over the skeleton of an earlier one, using the old structure as its foundation while becoming something entirely different on the surface. Stand on that bridge on a September afternoon now, and the light is identical. The angle of it, the color temperature, the way it catches the surface of the water. These things do not change on a human timescale, but the woman with her basket is gone. The tram sings on a different frequency. And the footage, fragile and irreplaceable, sits in its archive box and continues its long, slow work of being the only proof that she was ever there at all.